I'm Jonathan Owen, Vice President for Proudfoot EMEA. I'm focusing on the mining and metals industry. I'm a mining engineer. My background is running mining operations, exploration operations in Africa, particularly East Africa. And in terms of my experience with Proudfoot, I'm pretty fresh out the box. I'm two months in now. But it's a very exciting sector to be consulting in, and I think there's a lot of opportunity for Proudfoot and for the industry in general to really grasp the nettle and build good governance in this sector. So before I introduce the panel, I'll just give you an overview of what we're going to be discussing and give you a flavour of Proudfoot's view on that. So mining and risk are synonymous. Managing mining operations, exploration operations, really is all about managing risk, mitigating risk, but also identifying risk, which is not always the case. So throughout the life cycle of the mine, from exploration, operations, obviously development operations, and then through to closure, rehabilitation, successful execution requires meticulous identification of all risks inherent in the business. And those risks take on many different forms. We often categorise those forms as social, jurisdictional risk, environmental risk, project or capital project risks, and so on. And often mining exploration companies will address those risks within the respective silos of the organisation. So they'll address social and environmental risks within the respective departments within the company. They'll address finance-related risks within the finance department. But it's our view that most risks, not all risks, are interrelated to some degree or another. Be that managing water as a function of operational risk, geotechnical risk, but of course that also influences the environmental aspect of risk as well, and also the social aspect of water management in terms of water availability as well. Of course, in a world of diminishing water resources, we're all competing for the same thing. So further, it's often the case that risks are not identified sufficiently at the planning stage. So I think we'll all agree that, a lot of research tells us that less than 50% of capital projects meet or exceed budgets or schedule. And this is often always the case of having to deal with or reverse engineer or firefight risks that have materialised that have not been addressed during the planning stage. So again, it's our view as Proudfoot that risk management should be addressed at the early stage in the planning process and dealt with at that stage and strategised again during the early stages, and also managed and identified and mitigated against across the enterprise, across the whole operation, and break apart or work across those silos to address those. So this is what this discussion panel is here to address today. It's what forms do risks take these days? How do we mitigate against them? And what are the future trends for risks? So let me introduce the panel to you. So firstly we have Iain Pickard. Iain is co-founder of Strategia worldwide. It's a risk management consultancy set up in 2016, focusing on mitigating interrelated or interconnected risks relating to ESG, so social risks, jurisdictional risks, and so on. Previous to Strategia, Iain worked in several executive positions in finance, and this all follows a 20-year career with the British Army. We have Dr. Kim Morton. So Kim is a highly respected authority in water management, set up KLM Consulting, specialising water-related issues specific to the mining industry. And you have, I don't know how many degrees, but your PhD, I believe, relates to the hydrology of block caving. So there's your authority for you. And then we have John Mckenzie. John Mackenzie's he's been in the industry for 30 years, both on the operational side and on the investment side of mining. He's currently executive chairman of Mantis Copper, CEO of Audley Capital as well, of the mining practice of Audley Capital, non-exec director of CAS Minerals, and previously CEO of Anglo-American Copper and of Anglo-American Zinc. And I believe you started your career as GM of a nickel mine and smelter in Venezuela. So another huge amount of experience there to bring to the table. And then we have Matti Haitanen. Matti is CEO of the Finnish Metals Group and Vice Chairman of Terrafame. He's also Chairman of VTT, a technical research centre in Finland. And prior to his career in mining metals, he was senior civil servant in the Ministry of Economic Affairs in Finland. And then finally we have Dennis. Dennis is a graduate of Campbell School of Mines. And I'm 50, sorry, I'm a CS anyway. There's a lot of Royal School of Mines guys here as well, so we have a bit of friction there. So Dennis has 50 years of experience in developing mining projects around the world, so a vast amount of experience in dealing with mitigating risks. He's currently CEO of the AIM-listed Phoenix Copper. They've got Empire, or redeveloping the Empire project in Idaho, plus with an adult cobalt play. So this is the panel, and let me start off with the discussion with a question to John, or a topic for John to address. We've all spoken beforehand, of course, around what are our key areas of interest to discuss today, and one of the common themes throughout is ESG, social license to operate. So, John, we discussed the finance-related aspect of ESG previously, the importance that good ESG governance plays these days in and moving into the future in the ability to raise capital, not only raise capital, but raise capital at a reasonable cost. So, having been through a number of capital raises recently, significant capital raises, could you elaborate on your experiences of that?
Yeah, maybe just a few, before I get into the sort of area of ESG, just a few comments in general on risk management. I think whilst over the last 10 years or so, risk management has sort of progressively been moving from art towards science, I think one can't get away from the fact that there's still a huge amount of subjective judgment that's required in risk management, in identifying risks, assessing risks. And I think all of that means that really to do that job properly, risk management needs to be led by the board of directors and senior management. It's not a role that can be outsourced to some junior in the finance department. If it's really to be meaningful and if it's to actually sort of bring the results that one would hope and that the industry actually needs. Clearly, ESG is a very, very large element of the risks facing the mining industry today. And as Jonathan said, I'm the founder and chairman of Mantos Copper, where we've got 2 copper mines in Chile. Both those mines we're busy raising finance for. We've just this last weekend closed a $250 million financing for the one mine, and we're about to sort of start the financing, which is $800 million for the other mine. And having engaged a lot of export credit agencies, commercial banks in that financing process, one of the things which has really struck me is the extensive focus that investors have today in ESG and ESG risks. I would go as far as to say that when I look at their due diligence on each of our projects, around 50% of that due diligence today is being spent on ESG issues and 50% on other, which is quite remarkable when one thinks of the extent to which there are a lot of other issues as well. You've got your operations, your technical issues, your design issues. So it's become a massive, massive issue for the industry. And I do think it warrants, and I think you made the point, Jonathan, that the time to really be doing that is during the planning stages of the project. It's something which needs to continue for the entire life of the business. But good risk management and mitigation during the planning stages can make a huge difference. And maybe just sort of some examples of that. I was involved in Anglo American in the copper business when we set up the Quellaveco project in Peru. One of the things which we put in place was a dialogue table. It was hugely complex, and this was to address social issues, water issues in the region. We had 28 different government and community groups that we brought together into a dialogue table. And it was meant to take 3 months. It finally took 18 months. It was very complex, but I think at the end of that, we had a signed agreement that everybody understood the basis on which that project would be built and how that operation would be managed right through to closure and what would happen after closure. And I think it's that sort of planning. Now, obviously, you can't let it lie there. There's continuous work required to make sure you maintain those relationships, you maintain that social license. The social license takes years and years to build, but sort of minutes to destroy if you do it wrong. And another great sort of example we had was when I was running our zinc business in Ireland. We were building a wind farm, and again it was a different set, a very different set of stakeholders. But it was local farmers who really had a concern about all these turbines that were going to be popping up in their neighborhood. But with a lot of work being done with each of them, we eventually got to the point that not just the mine had wind turbines put on it, but all the local farms wanted wind turbines put on their farms as well. So you can really create sort of win-wins out of this. And I think that's got to be the ultimate objective of this engagement, is looking for the win-win. I think my sort of last comment on ESG is there's also a lot of work that needs to go into things like mapping your stakeholders. It's quite easy to sort of get channel vision into a single group of local community members or something, but in reality, every mining operation has a lot of different stakeholders, and probably the first step of all of this is actually mapping those stakeholders and making sure everyone is identified before you can actually then start addressing the specific ones of each of those parties. But I do think that the real key is engaging in this as early as one can and setting things up in the right way before you start, and then accepting that there's still a lot of work to be done for the rest of the life of the mine.
Yes. I'm probably more guilty than most because my experience is predominantly in Africa, so in challenging environments and challenging political environments. And I think it's easy to forget how relevant and pertinent social license to operate is to first world countries. And I think, Matty, you've got some experience of that in Finland, for example. And maybe you could share your experience.
Thanks. Basically, our history is such that we took over, about 4 years ago, we took over one notorious mine in Finland, northern Finland, which was previously called Talvivaara. And previously it was a public company with 80,000 shareholders and very bad reputation in Finland. They had a lot of environmental difficulties, and they never reached those production and financial objectives that they had. And eventually the company went into bankruptcy, and we, like I said, we took over about 4 years ago and started the ramp up of the production from scratch. And basically, when we took over the site, there was 10 million cubic meters of excess water on the mine area. The operation had lost all the support from the local community and also on national level. There was a lot of criticism, and basically we consider that Finland is one of the leading countries when it comes to mining in Europe. We can say that this one operation ruined the mining industry's reputation in Finland totally. But then we took over about 4 years ago, and the key objective was to make, first of all, to make sure that no environmental difficulties will happen in future, or that we can secure the environmental situation, because there had been, for example, very difficult and bad tailings leakage a couple of years before, and basically we started the ramp up from the scratch, and what we did was that we very carefully made sure that the operation works as it was supposed to work, and then after a couple of years we were in a position that we had secured the environmental situation. We got rid of all of that excess water. according to the permits. And afterwards, we can say that we managed to take care of that situation so that all of these kind of like questions related to social license to operate and environmental questions, they were the first priority, but that was like kind of like a school book example that this type of environmental responsibility questions and commercial questions went hand in hand, because without good care of environmental issues, you cannot have a successful commercial operation. So afterwards, we can say that we didn't have any like discrepancies between these two objectives, but they went hand in hand. But what is something that we can learn here is that the public opinion and public view doesn't change that easily. So even now, when after 4 years we have achieved a full-scale production level that the predecessor originally was aiming for, and we can show that the operation is commercially viable, but still even today the kind of like overall public attitude tends to be fairly negative, and that is because of these old accidents and old incidents, and it is something that is it takes quite a lot of time to change people's thinking. And if we consider risk management, I think that it's very good lesson from this project that the kind of like public opinion that the company has and that the project has, that is part of the capital that the company and project can use for their benefit. And once it is lost, then it's something that is extremely difficult to have again. And hopefully after additional good years, we can say that we have been able to convince everyone that those old difficulties are history, and no one needs to be afraid that something nasty will happen again. But it takes a lot of time, and I think that this is also a question for the whole mining industry, because this is also something that if something bad happens to your neighbor company, then it also reflects your own kind of like a brand image and your position within the community. And therefore, I think that the industry as a whole should be very careful to take things forward in the right manner and making sure that risk management, especially when it comes to environmental issues, is in place.
So, turning to Kim, we've spoken about environmental risk, social risk, and so on. And there's been a number of presentations this morning, all referencing risk in one way or another. But there's one definite theme that comes throughout all these conversations, discussions so far, is around water management. That's your field of interest, both from an operational perspective in terms of geotechnical risk on tailings dams. We look at the failure in Brazil recently. But also on the environmental side. So, what for you? What does best practice look like for you as a leading hydrologist?
I mean, water is always an ever-present risk. Wherever you've got a head of water, there's a risk of that water moving into an area where it can cause severe damage. What is very worrying in the industry at the moment is the disconnection between geotechnical advances, hydrological knowledge, and mining. And although there's been a lot of work moving forward on addressing water risk, it tends to look at the effect rather than the cause. And for example, tailings dam monitoring. At the moment, everyone's putting up prisms to look for movement. The same with slope stability in open pits. Most mines have got prisms where they monitor movement of millimeters of the rock. But that's monitoring effect, not cause. When a slope's been established, one of the few things you can change to increase its stability is the weight of water in that slope. And that's best monitored using pore pressure monitoring devices, where that data is then sent to information and then knowledge. And that's really critical because it puts power in the hands of management to see what exactly is the risk of that slope. Not later, when that slope's already moving, but before. And even more importantly, that water weight can be measured, and that weight can be interpreted by the geotechnical engineers working with the hydrologists. And then the weight of water can be reduced. So modern data techniques and the ability to monitor, say, 1,000 points at one time, in real time, and produce on a dashboard, means that you can actually manage the risk. You're not just accepting the risk and saying that slope will fail. You can say, I can actually put into place active depressurization, active removal of weight of the water in that slope. And using definite algorithms, you can show very clearly on a dashboard, virtual reality, mixed reality, a hologram, if you like, the state of that slope. And you can actually manipulate the risk by turning on pumps or putting in a drainage system. So I think that, to me, would be the next step forward for the mining industry in addressing risk, and that's looking at cause rather than effect. And of course, everyone's aware that our industry, sadly, climbs upwards on tombstones. And the latest tailings dam failure, thank goodness, has made everyone aware of what more can be done to protecting people from water risk. But it really is the tip of the iceberg. We have very many other issues where water is stored and becomes a problem. With mine closure, most of those mines are going to flood, and that needs monitoring as well. But the light at the end of the tunnel, shining very brightly, thank goodness, is that modern monitoring and modern data management techniques, and of course, transmission of that data, and full transparency, which can be shared between shareholders, between directors, between mine managers, and the local population. You can have full transparency as to the situation. And I think with miscommunication and fake news bouncing around the world, the more transparency, the better it is for the industry.
Thank you. I mean, that ties into, well, it's quite nicely onto operational risk more generally speaking. So you speak of big data and real-time monitoring and ultimately allowing people, not at the face necessarily, but certainly management and supervisors, the ability to make decisions in real time based on that data. And that's something that maybe the mining industry is not as used to as we would see in other industries that we work with, such as in aerospace and manufacturing. So probably more general question to the miners in the group. We as Proudfoot speak of or advocate the idea of a management operating system that draws together the relevant information in a manner that is usable in real time by those empowered to do it, or the right behaviours to make a decision at that point, and the authority to do so. And maybe for John, really, because you run mining operations yourself, and for Dennis as well. How do you see that moving forward? Mining is undergoing quite a revolution in terms of adoption of technology, big data. We have a workforce which needs to step up with that or be developed, and for their behaviours to be realigned or improved to adopt that. In your experience, how do you see that moving forward? Do you see there being friction in that process, or do you see that that it's heading in the right direction?
Personally, I think it's a huge opportunity, actually. I think sort of big data and the systems that are sort of, Kim spoken about some of those systems that are available. Those are available not just for water, but are available in kind of every phase of exploration, operating your mine, operating your plants, and then ultimately even in closure afterwards. So I think sort of you can't sort of differentiate mining management systems from your risk systems. The two need to be fully integrated, and I think it has been the case for some years that your systems are fully integrated, and whether it's with your kind of ISO type systems integrated into your management systems, that's been I think sort of well established, but the systems are improving all the time, and our ability to sort of monitor online immediately and very large amounts of data brought into those systems to an extent, I think the technology is moving ahead perhaps a bit faster than management's understanding of what it's really capable of doing. And I think one of the challenges the industry has is to really understand the possibilities that this all has. And with that, I think we would find ourselves able to materially reduce the number of unplanned incidents that we have.
Well, we're at Phoenix. I mean, we're at the small end of the market, put it that way. And I think there's obviously a lot of junior and mid-tier sort of company people here who know all about risk and what's involved. We tend to, I think one of the important things, certainly as far as we're concerned, coming back to social risk, I've been evaluating projects for many years, in fact, since 1984, and seen many projects. Risk, if you like, is second nature to our thinking, and has to be. And I think I was saying earlier on that social risk that's the thing I've seen kill more projects than anything else, with people not understanding it. And putting in procedures particularly, and recruitment of the right people with the right sensitivities for all sorts of risk mitigation. Understanding the way that the local systems work, the way the local people think, environmental, how governments work. That I perceive as the biggest risks, the biggest mistakes that I've seen in my career. I must admit, I've seen with people sending the wrong people into, and I'm quite sure a lot of you have seen it, the wrong people into environments. And employing people when you do get into production or when you're developing a project to actually employing the wrong people. And I think that has been, I've seen more bad examples of that sort of thing, during my career. And I've seen projects, some of the best projects I've seen have the wrong people in, and I'm quite sure a lot of us can identify. So there's not only, if you like, operational risks, and I think you're right, environmental risks, but the appreciation, the sensitivity of an industry which is generally perceived by the public as being insensitive historically. And I think we've been our own worst enemy as far as I'm concerned, over the years that I've seen. But I think, yes, the appreciation of putting in systems now, and where we're working, for example, the appreciation of everything from not only the local people, but the local wildlife, and that sort of thing.
Maybe just to add to that is, I think the sort of risk assessment is just very much the first part of the process. One of the big functions of your risk management systems is to make sure that those mitigations that ultimately mitigate those risks, and then the assurance systems that give you that comfort that actually those mitigations are being implemented over periods of 5 to 50 years are actually in place. And I think that's having that systemized is absolutely critical, particularly where you've got sort of turnover during the life of an operation. A lot of those risks that get identified can sort of fall off the radar unless you've properly systemized the risk management system, and all the way through to what are your mitigations, how do you update that system, how do you make sure it's continually updated with all those millions of data points that you're getting in every day. And then how do you make sure that your assurance process is adequate to deal with those risks?
Yes. I mean, as you say, it's plan the work the plan the pay. That's the basic mantra in all that we need to do in mining, and it's no different from risk management. It's
I think
we're
an industry that works in war zones. So I mean that, if you like, is the ultimate physical risk that we have. We can work in those sort of places, and it's a matter of degree. The whole industry is a risk industry, and any business is a risk, but mining industry particularly. And when I see some of the places that we do work, we've got to be organised. Simple as that. With the right people.
That's an excellent jumping off point for Iain to probably step in with.
I thought that might be a good lead.
Jurisdictional risk.
Left the army to stop working.
Yeah. So sorry. We've got the point of talking about jurisdictional risk, and you have a lot of experience in identifying country risk and putting together mitigation plans as part of wider risk management strategies and systems in the mining industry. Maybe give us some colour on some of the things that you've done in some, I wouldn't say war zones, but in more challenging environments.
I can, but also, if you wouldn't mind, I'll pick up a point that John made, because it's just so important, which is this long-term view. Because again and again, you see in the industry, that across the development cycle, you've got an operation being run by different people. Explorers come in, the early stage developers, a big company then buys it. But of course, the communities and the political stakeholders are often the same. So what you will get, unless there is a consistent long-term plan, is you will get a community saying to the new regime, "Oh well, so and so promised me X 2 or 3 years ago," and of course there's no without a systemised approach, there is no counter to that. And I give you a bit of a case study, some work we did for a major mining company in Latin America, and I'll spare their blushes, I won't say who it was, but they got themselves to all sorts of problems, and as ever, it wasn't one thing. There were environmental issues, but they were created ultimately by technical issues. I think when they expanded the mine, they expanded the leach pad, to save money, they took some shortcuts, which came back and bit them, but that was compounded by the way they'd run their political relations, which were considered to be very untransparent. It was then compounded by the way that, rightly or wrongly, the supply chain was viewed as being manipulated to favour certain companies who were political supporters of the local governor. So it was all these things coming together. And we were asked to come in and provide a proper long-term integrated strategy. And it doesn't come cheap. And over the remaining life of the mine, to do all the things that we recommended, included community programs and the rest of it, we thought it would be $20 to $30 million, which sounds a lot of money. But if you're preserving the license to operate of a $2 billion asset, which we were, I think that's a pretty good price to pay. But I think unless that money is factored in at the start of the project, it's always difficult to do it properly, because you're then scraping around against a tight budget to find money for something that's viewed as perhaps not a priority. Whereas really it should be, a very, very good point made by Dennis and I said to him, over your 40, 50 years of mining, what's the big lesson learned? He said, mines fail because of social risk, ultimately, yes, more than any other reason. So long-term view, I think, so important. One thing we have learnt in the military over the last 30 years, since the end of the Cold War, is the challenges of working in multi-stakeholder environments. It's not just the good guys and the bad guys. You've got people who are with you, people who are against you, people who are with you today but might be against you tomorrow, people who are sitting on the fence. And that's very similar to the environment you find in many parts of the world around a mine site. And therefore, this stakeholder mapping is so important. And we take it a stage further. We do what we call centre of gravity analysis. So you look at a particular stakeholder and you say, well, what's really important to them? And how do you, if they're your supporters, how do you protect that interest? So if it's a community, it'll be their future prosperity, jobs for their children, all the rest of it, education for their children. If they're against you, if they're an environmental group, what is it they're really focused on? Well, how can you diffuse that, adjust that? And as always, most people are on the fence. So, okay, what do we need to do to get them off the fence? So I think that's a really important exercise. And then just pick up the point that Kim made, this business of proactive controls. If you understand the risk, you can then start looking at what are the proactive controls. So monitoring the water levels in the dam, or in the rock wall, or in the community, social media monitoring. What are the attitudes? Are they with you? What are they saying? Picking things up and having the early warnings out there. But you need to do that initial risk assessment. And I think last but not least, the one thing we take away again and again is the importance of behaviours in risk management. That sounds a rather odd thing to say because it's viewed as a science, but actually ultimately, if a company's got a good risk culture, it's so much easier. Someone said to me about one of our clients, the problem with this company is good news takes the elevator and bad news takes the stairs. But if you've got a senior leadership who set the right tone at the top, who are prepared to be challenged and want to be told when things are going wrong, it sets the tone through the company. And you don't get the phenomenon we see on occasions where an internal audit report that is not a good one gets locked in the bottom drawer. So I would say, in reverse order, get the culture right, and then all the other things we're talking about will begin to fall into place.
Thank you.
Can I just add an interesting point there? I think communication as well mitigates risk in some ways. Don't be afraid. I mean, we're all happy to disseminate good news, but if it's bad news, be honest, and communication is very important, and particularly with regards to environmental. If you get, there's worst thing you can do is pull the wool over people's eyes and that sort of thing. So I think honesty within the industry is an important point.
And you're so right, because what it does, it undermines trust.
Yes, absolutely.
And you can be transparent, and you can put on the internet the water levels and everything else, but if they don't trust you, people will dismiss it and say, oh, well, that's just company propaganda. And actually, I think also, don't underestimate the value of independent reporting, an independent body. We do find very often that people will talk to us and tell us things that they won't tell the management of the company, because they're viewed as independent. And I think that can help sometimes.
Yeah.
To continue from there, it was very, very good point what you said earlier, that obviously good risk management and good social and environmental responsibility, for example, are essential part of securing long-term operation and securing the possibility to continue operations as planned. So that is part of that reward that you will get when you do things properly. But what we can also see is that there is perhaps a small change now happening because of the boom of the battery industry. Because OEMs clearly want to have raw materials that have good traceability and that have good sustainability regard. And it seems that in future the sustainability of the producers will be more and more a competitive advantage, so that eventually, hopefully, you will get even a better price for your product if it's produced responsibly. And for example, if we consider that BMW just announced that they will stop using Congolese cobalt. So that is a kind of like a good example that OEMs are really putting effort here. And that is going to hopefully change also mining industry's approach here.
Just curiosity, how do you see that being actually implemented? I don't want to get into blockchain and what have you, but is that where you see the industry or the demand side of the industry heading in terms of supply chain?
Yeah, so basically, obviously, it seems that especially in battery minerals, that the whole concept of supply chain and value chain is becoming more and more important, because there is a scarcity of some key raw materials, or let's say so that even if there is no scarcity, then the kind of like an increase of supply will be so expensive. For example, if we consider nickel mines, we know that how expensive it is to open new nickel mines, and therefore all of these end producers want to be sure that they have access to good raw materials and a secured supply of raw materials. And obviously there, for example, these new technologies, blockchain and so on, they have an important role, because through these technologies we can make sure that raw materials come from they are said to come.
We certainly see that in the diamond industry. They're probably leading in that area in terms of identifying the provenance of minerals from the source to retailers. Okay, so we've got just under 10 minutes of the session left. So open up to the audience to ask questions. Charles. Let's go on to the back, Charles.
I'd just like to agree quite a lot with what's been said about looking at the people that live, the communities that live around mines, because it is very important that you understand what each of their agendas are, because such as in Africa, sometimes you can get a lot of different tribes all working at the same mine, and it's very important to understand what the agendas are of each person to do with the community and getting the community on board. And I think it's equally important that it has to be very transparent from the start, the good things and the bad things, so that everybody understands where they are. And I'd like to say it was a good discussion with the panel.
Thank you. From my experience, I completely resonate with your observation. I was developing for Helium-1 a natural helium resource in the Rukwa Valley. Now it wouldn't have been a mine developed as such. It'd be more like a natural gas operation. So a couple of wells and a small plant to purify, and then a small infrastructure to export the product by road. So in all, probably about 20 people working on the operation once it's in operation and ramped up. But initially, the perception of the local community was that we were going to be another Acacia or another Shanta Gold and start employing 3,000 local people, which would have probably employed all the adults in the local 3 districts. So that was the perception they had as we arrived. And in hindsight, we should have got in there sooner through our local representatives and addressed that perception. So yeah, perception management and setting expectations is critical, I think, at the early stage.
Communication again.
Sorry?
Communication
exactly.
again. Yeah,
yes.
Absolutely.
And I think and expectation management. We did a piece of work in the Caucasus last year where one of the issues was everybody thought they were going to get jobs. But it wasn't explained to them that to get a job driving a huge $10 million Caterpillar truck, you've got to pass a simulator test and all these other things. And of course, a lot of them didn't. And it was a simple thing that could have been that could have been organised an awful lot better with a bit of forethought.
That's right.
I think part of the key is also making sure the consultation process is a genuine consultation process and isn't going through the motions, which I think the industry has been somewhat guilty of in the past. And when you talk about understanding those stakeholders' requirements, it can either be a sort of box-ticking exercise or it can be a genuine effort to really get an in-depth understanding of what those are. And it's only with that you find the right solutions that actually allow you to then mitigate those risks and deal with those issues going forward.
Charles.
Okay. My question is how the industry should thoughtfully manage new technology risk. So we're now moving into a phase where a lot of the big mining companies going down the road of major initiatives in innovation and looking for step changes, for strategic flexibility or much lower cost or enabling new assets. But that's in conflict with the traditional way of doing things when it comes to financing new projects, permitting them. And then there's all the cultural issues internally around, everyone fearing for their own job and the perception of taking a risk, being the one to select a new technology. So what's the right way to balance that, to get the best out of what new innovation could do, but without impeding the right solutions into the industry that should have its place there in the future?
Just before the panel, I'd just pick up on the point about, as you said, how do you transition? And it's the ideal situation is you're starting with a greenfield project and you design your mine around automation, for example, and you're bringing in locals, probably possibly unskilled labour who you're skilling up specifically for that method or that operation. But quite often, there are a lot of mines with 20 years life of mine left that have to compete, that have to adopt new technologies. And you need to bring that workforce with you through that transformation effectively. So how do you do that while maintaining? How do you step into the future while keeping one foot in the past and maintaining a profitable operation? And what we see is that as you bring new technologies in, or you go fully autonomous in a mine, the reality or the expectation or perception that the communities and the workforce and the unions have that you're going to be cutting them significantly it doesn't play out. Those skills, those individuals get transferred onto different skills, possibly above surface, control rooms, maintenance. So from my perspective, again, it comes back down to managing perceptions, communicating early. So if any of you guys would
I think one of the things that I've seen over the last few years particularly is the demise of practical people particularly. In other words, that we tend to be run more now by algorithms than we are by people. And gut feeling, for example, mining an ore body, getting underground and looking at the structural geology, for example, and not necessarily... I can remember one person coming along to me and he said, "Dennis, can you find me a mining engineer, please, who can use a pencil?" And the reason being, very simply, was because they were using computers and the machinery didn't go around the corners when they mined the and I think to a certain extent, one thing as an industry we mustn't do is lose contact with the fact that we're mining rock. And practical people are needed. I think there's a big move in too much thinking about risk and analysis and this sort of thing without actually bringing on new engineers that actually can mine. And I see this, in various places.
And I would say the same, absolutely the same for above ground risk. By all means, do your social media monitoring and your desk-based analysis. However, there's still no substitute for talking to people. At every level, from the government to the company management to local people in the communities and the guys driving the trucks.
Yeah. Personally, I think it would be a nice problem to have if the mining industry was rapidly adopting new technologies. I certainly haven't seen that sort of being terribly evident in the mining industry that's the problem. It's actually, to me, it's the opposite problem, that we're extremely slow to adopt new technologies. Oh, absolutely, and I think we certainly haven't covered ourselves in glory in how we deal with that perception. And I think part of the problem is that we just are so unused to implementing significant kind of new technologies that nobody's really given it enough thought. But certainly, I think if one was to do so, it shouldn't be that difficult an exercise to map out the pros and the cons of the new technology, who the people will be impacted positively and negatively, and then really work through it as a problem and work through how one deals with it. And
society's changing as well. The attitude, I mean, there's a blame culture around now, so you've got to mitigate risk sometimes ridiculously, so that somebody doesn't actually get sued for what they do. I mean, I recently had a case I saw where the quotation, for example, for a metallurgical plant was 250% more than it was actually going to be, on the basis that they didn't want to get sued because they were wrong, and they were the factors that mounted up. So that was risk mitigation to a ridiculous extent. And that pervades what we're doing at the moment.
But equally, risk is the flip side of opportunity. And I think technology offers the industry a new opportunity. I mean, there are risks associated with it. We're dependent on industrial control systems and cyber risk and the rest of it. But, and it's very different from the traditional model of employing lots of low-skilled people, but you have an opportunity to genuinely upscale communities on a generational level. Sending the kids to college who are going to have the skills to operate these sophisticated systems in 10 years' time. But again, I go back to my point, this requires a long-term view.
And obviously, when we talk about new technologies, it comes to financing, because you need to have someone who is ready to take that financial risk. And we all know that, for example, when we talk about project finance, for example, banks are not willing to take any unnecessary risks. And that is the kind of like ultimate problem with new technologies, basically.
Do we have time for one more question? Sorry, maybe two more questions.
Yes. Is climate change already becoming an issue for you in the mining sector? I mean,
absolutely it is. And I think it's no coincidence that the new evolution of the Equator Principles, EP4, has climate change as it's one of its first things. And it's going to have a big impact on water management. Either not enough or too much. And I think that the sort of technologies that Kim is talking about linked to sophisticated weather forecasting will become increasingly important because this is going to be an issue for mining companies around the world, I think, looking at Kim.
The way we've been approaching it, because there are so many conflicting metrics, is we look at it on a case-by-case basis. I mean, particularly one area I've been working in the Gold Coast of Australia, they tend to get a lot of cyclonic rainfall, which means it's very straightforward to take the moisture content of the atmosphere as the cyclone approaches the mine on the east coast and calculate what millimetres are going to fall over a 24, 48-hour period. And then you use the data you're collecting on the mine, which is of how prepared are they for that stormwater reception. In other words, are their stormwater dams empty or full? Can they cope with an 80 millimetre rainfall event in 24 hours or not? And that means actually having well-spread data management points, which then get fed into information, which then become knowledge. So climate change specifics are still in their infancy, but what we can do in the water management space is improve prediction on specific areas and improve the metrics that are recorded to forewarn a mine if they have to start pulling plant out of the pit or if they can leave it there. And not only is that working in the mining industry, it's also working for NGOs where they're using satellite data to prepare for the next hurricane, for example. So climate change has huge opportunity to manage water better. So as you said, risk is the flip side of opportunity. What we try to do is change risk in water to opportunities by collecting the right information, making sure it's correct, converting it into knowledge. And that can be done through virtual reality, mixed reality, holograms. You've got to make it sexy and simple for the decision makers. So when I talked about transparency in measuring metrics, it's very important to make sure that what you're presenting is easily understandable. So thank you for that question.
Can I just finish on a lighter note? Ask the same question to a Greenlander. I was up there, and when I mentioned climate change, they were absolutely delighted because more of the country actually was opening up. So receding glaciers were doing favours for them.
Very site-specific.
Yes, very, very site-specific.
Highly controversial.
But I do think that mining companies are going to be, and do today and will always compete for investment dollars. And I think climate change measures and metrics are going to become quite a major factor in where those investment dollars go. And if your metrics are worse than the next companies, I think you're going to lose out on investment dollars going forward.
One last question, gentlemen.
It seems to me one of the ever-present risks in the industry has been just its simple cyclical nature. In other words, we pendulum back and forwards between skill shortages, high cost of wages, then excess capacity, rapid expansions at times when it's most expensive to build because everybody's doing it, and then shareholders being unhappy because they don't see the returns they want during that sort of process. I mean, do you have any golden bullets to suggest about how you de-cycle that process, and whether there's anything that can be done to improve, I think, that next generation of people coming into the industry, their view of the industry as a result of that?
Yeah, that's a very difficult one, because I think the same factors that cause the same cycles each time have a bad habit of repeating themselves. And
yeah, I
think what you see today is sort of sentiment is down. But in the industry I'm most involved in today, which is copper, the fundamentals for the future look great. The lead times to bring a new copper mine online are quite a few years. That suggests one should be investing today to bear the fruit sort of in 3 or 4 or 5 years' time. But trying to find investment dollars today is a lot more difficult than it is when you're at the top of the cycle. So I think it's, and it's understandable, but I think it kind of repeats itself each cycle, and I'm not sure anybody's really found that golden bullet yet.
I think today's copper price, for example, highlights one of the greatest risks that we have. I think not only the industry, but also everybody is politicians and arguments between the Americans and the Chinese and how it affects us. And I think sometimes forgetting what the underlying fundamentals are, particularly in the copper market at the moment. So, yeah, I see that as a major risk and always has been and will be ever present as long as we've got politicians. Very, very argumentative.
Okay, before we get on to discussion about Trump offering to buy Greenland and...
well, there we are, Greenland, and there's the connection, yeah.
We should perhaps wrap up. I think we're a little bit over time here. So thanks to all of you for what hopefully has been quite an informative discussion. Risk is a vast topic in itself, so we're only scratching the surface on its implications for our business, but thank you again. Okay.